We're now looking at a teaching video on trigonometry. The subtopic is 4 quadrants. When we talk about 4 quadrants, we are talking about, in the 4 quadrants, the 4 ranges of values of theta, the angle. So let's name these 4 quadrants this way in anti-clockwise direction. So 0 degrees to 90 degrees. So the first quadrant angle will be any angle between 0 degrees and 90 degrees. So I'll call this first quadrant. And then in the second quadrant, I have angles between 90 degrees and 180 degrees. So that will be my second quadrant. And for the third quadrant, I will have angles between 180 degrees and 270. And for the fourth quadrant, I have angles between 270 and 360. So that is my fourth quadrant. So I'm going to use something to help you remember the facts of the 4 quadrants. That is, add sugar to coffee. And the idea I'm looking at here is the sine function. If I name theta as the first quadrant angle, sine theta will give me a positive value. So in other words, if I just take any angle from 0 degrees to 90 degrees, I will get sine theta equals to positive value. Cos theta, tangent theta will all give me positive value. That's why you have the A here, all functions, so X. For second quadrant angle, I have sine bracket 180 degrees minus theta. That is my second quadrant angle. That will also give me a positive value. So implying that whatever I don't write here, like cos bracket 180 minus theta, will give me a negative value. Going down to my third quadrant, tangent bracket 180 degrees plus theta will give me positive value. So implying that the sine and the cos of this angle will be giving me a negative value. For the fourth quadrant, cos bracket 360 degrees minus the basic angle will give me positive value. So the conversion that I'm looking at out of this is if I have sine theta, the value would be the same as sine bracket the second quadrant angle. However, the sign will be different, come to sine 180 plus theta. So to compensate that, I put a negative in front. So sine bracket 180 degrees plus the basic angle. Then coming to the fourth quadrant angle, you can see that in the fourth quadrant, sine the angle will give me a negative value. So here, negative sine bracket 360 minus theta. Then come to cos theta. Cos function gives a negative value in the second quadrant. So negative cos the second quadrant angle. And in the third quadrant, cos function will also give a negative value. So negative cos bracket the third quadrant angle. In the fourth quadrant, cos function will give a positive value. So I will just have cos the fourth quadrant angle. Come to tangent. Tangent theta. Well, in the second quadrant, the tangent function will give me a negative value. So negative tangent the second quadrant angle. In the third quadrant, the tangent function will give me a positive result. So I will have tangent the third quadrant angle. In the fourth quadrant, the tangent function will give me a negative value. So I have negative tangent 360 minus theta. So this is reflected in the kind of information I get in the four quadrants. So you can see in the first two quadrants, I have sine positive. So over here, positive, positive. Let's look at cos in the third and fourth. Cos will be negative and negative. So I will have negative in the third, negative in the fourth. This is how you remember this long equation. We'll look at the relationship of sine, cos, tangent, and the four quadrant angles. We actually mentioned that just now in the last part, and if you can, try to record it. Sine, the second quadrant angle, and then the third is a negative, and the fourth a negative. Okay, let's try to recall what you have been taught in the previous slide. Think the four quadrants. Cos is positive in the first quadrant, negative in the second, negative in the third, and positive in the fourth. So, negative in the second, negative in the third, and then positive in the fourth. Let's try to recall for the function of tangent. First quadrant, positive. Second quadrant, negative. Third quadrant, positive. And the fourth quadrant, negative. So tangent theta equals to negative tangent second quadrant angle. And for the third quadrant, tangent is positive. So tangent, the third quadrant angle. And tangent is negative in the fourth quadrant, negative tangent, the fourth quadrant angle. Over here, I like us to pay attention to the angles. Theta, first quadrant angle. The second quadrant angle is 180 minus theta, and the third quadrant angle 180 plus theta, and the fourth quadrant angle 360 minus theta. So this is the relationship sine, cos, and tangent has or have with the four different quadrant angles. Now, using another way to capture the same information, first we look at sine theta. The graph of sine has a range of value. The lowest value is -1, the highest value is 1. So this is the sine graph. So this is how you read it. At theta equals 0, y is 0. At theta equals pi on 2, y equals 1. At theta equals pi, y equals 0. So these are the critical points from which you can actually plot the sine graph. But I think it's important that you remember the basic shape of the graph. But I'm using this graph here to illustrate what we know about the four quadrants, trying to relate the two ideas together. Now take this as your first quadrant, because the first quadrant angles lie between 0 degrees and 90 degrees. What you see here are two equivalent radian measurements. 0 degrees in radians is 0. 90 degrees in radians is pi on 2. So that is the first quadrant angle. Now you realize that for this particular section, the curve is above the x-axis. So what it says is that the y values are positive. So we remember in the first quadrant, the sine first quadrant angle will give us positive values. In the second quadrant, the range of angle is from pi on 2 to pi. Again, you look at the graph is above the theta axis. So the y value is positive. Going into the third quadrant, so second quadrant, positive. The third quadrant here, the curve is below the theta axis. The y value will be negative. So in the first and second quadrant, sine will be positive. But in the third, negative, and of course, in the fourth, will also be negative. You can see that here. This is the fourth quadrant. The y values are below the theta axis. So if you are looking for positive values of sine theta, you can find the theta in the first quadrant as well as in the second quadrant. Let's look at y equals to cos theta. The range of the graph is from -1 to 1. And the curve of cos theta is like this. So you can see the lowest point, y is -1. The highest point, there are two of those points, y equals to 1. So again, this is the first quadrant. The angles is from 0 to pi on 2. The curve is above the theta axis, so positive value of y's. Then in the second quadrant, and the range of the angles is pi on 2 to pi. And you notice that this part of the cos graph is below the theta axis. All the values of y will be negative. Next, the third quadrant, the angles from pi to 3 pi on 2. If you're looking at degrees, then it will be 180 to 270 degrees. And the part of the graph here in this section is below the theta axis. So the y value will be negative. And over here, fourth quadrant, the angle is from 3 pi on 2 to 2 pi. And the part of the graph is above the theta axis, so the y values are positive. So from what we did just now, the four quadrant ideas, cos positive in the first quadrant, negative in the second, negative in the third, and positive in the fourth. And you can see this result corresponding to the graph. Positive, negative, negative, positive. Positive, negative, negative, positive. So that's how the four quadrant is related to the graph itself. So for the next function, tangent theta, the graph is like this. For this graph, there is no maximum, no minimum, because this graph stretches all the way upwards and downwards. But you can see from this graph, in the first quadrant, the y values are positive. In the second quadrant, the y values are negative below because this part of the graph is below the theta axis. Then for the third quadrant, this part of the graph is above the x-axis. positive, and this is negative. And in the fourth quadrant, the tangent graph is below the theta axis, and the y values correspondingly will be negative. You can see from here, relating back to the fourth quadrant, first quadrant, tangent positive, in the second quadrant, negative, third quadrant, positive, and in the fourth, negative. Positive, negative, positive, negative. Positive, negative, positive, negative. So the whole idea of four quadrant angles is related back to the graph. So we have come to the end of these teaching videos. I hope that you actually can remember where the tangent and the cos and the sine graph will be positive and where they will be negative.